All right, so back to some PowerPoint. I'm going to be going back and forth between PowerPoints and using Fledermaus. So let's get started. All right, so again, this webinar is going to focus on movie making in Fledermaus, flight paths, camera objects, and keyframes. It's an overview of what I hope to cover today. I'm going to try really hard to stick within my 1 hour allotted time. I tend to go over, but I'll do my best to be done within an hour. What I'm going to talk to today. First, I'm going to just do a quick review of the Fledermaus suite and Fledermaus file types for those of you who are fairly new to the software. Then I'm going to review the movie making terminology. So what is a flight path, a camera object, etc. I'm going to introduce you to the time interface of Fledermaus, and that includes our time bar and keyframes. I'm going to show you how you can create a dynamic flight path using a mouse or a 3D interaction device. I'm going to show you the alternative to that, which is creating a flight path with XYZ points. We'll talk about how you can edit flight paths after you create them. We'll have a brief description of how you can use keyframes in other ways. It's kind of an advanced keyframe, so I'll give you one example of that. I'll show you how you can play your flight path back in Fledermaus or iView 4D. I'll show you how you can create a movie. So there's a difference between the flight path that exists in the scene and an actual movie that you can distribute. So I'll show you how you can render out an MPEG or WMV. And throughout the whole session, I'll try and give you some tips and tricks about how to get the best flight path. Just a warning, and I'll repeat this in case we have new people that come on. When we go into Fledermaus and we start doing stuff with the flight path, the rendering is going to get very degraded. There's nothing I can really do about that. Just when we have active rendering with motion in Fledermaus, it tends to really get degraded over the webinar. It's not a reflection of what you'll see when you actually do this yourself. So when you're watching me, once the flight path plays back, it's going to be very choppy. Just try and really focus on how I set it up and what I did, and don't really focus on the flight path itself. Another warning, our power went out at the IVS 3D office, so I am working from home. So if you see it or you hear a dog barking or anything like that, I apologize ahead of time. All right, so the first thing, briefly, I'd like to review a little bit about the Fledermaus suite. Fledermaus is a suite of software, and if you're in Windows, this presentation, by the way, is fairly Windows-centric. So Mac and Linux users out there, you'll have to convert your knowledge of where things exist. The Fledermaus suite, if you went under the Start menu, is under the folder called Fledermaus 7, and it is a suite of software with many different modules that do different things. Most of the modules are there to get data into the Fledermaus module itself, and the Fledermaus module is our main visualization module. And that's the one we're going to be focusing on today. Movie making, flight path making, all occurs within Fledermaus. I'm also going to talk about iView 4D a little bit. You can play back flight paths in iView 4D. iView 4D is our free viewer that people can download online. So if you make a nice scene with a flight path embedded in it, you can pass it along to somebody and they can play back the flight path. The next two screens are just a review of our Fledermaus file types. So the two core file types in Fledermaus are SD files and scene files. The first one is the SD file. SD stands for Scientific Data Object, and that is the primary Fledermaus file type. We also call those data objects or just objects, and that's one set of data. The most typical SD object is like the one you see on the left, and that's a surface or a DTM SD. And that's what you tend to make out of your gridded and ungridded data in Fledermaus. But anything you bring into Fledermaus eventually becomes an SD file. So we have point SDs and line SDs. The SD file that we'll be using today is the camera object SD. And that's what you see on the right. So when we're making a flight path, you make a physical camera model in your scene, and that is what lets you visualize how you're moving through the scene. And the camera has keyframes associated with it that record that time element. The other type of Fledermaus file type is a .scene file, and a scene file is a group of SDs that are all saved together in one package. They're mostly self-contained, so you can just copy the scene file itself and pass it along to somebody, and they'll have all the files that they need to make that run. There are a few exceptions if you're using specific types of files, but we won't be using any of those for this basic fly-through demonstration. Camera objects, the camera object SD is often stored as part of a scene, and then when you open the scene you can play back the motion that's stored in that camera. So movie making in the Fledermaus suite, we're going to be focusing again on the Fledermaus module itself and iView4D. Flightpaths and movies are made in the Fledermaus module. You don't need any of the other modules to use this functionality. Just a version 6 note for our longtime users. The movie client module that used to be part of version 6 was used to render movies. That functionality is now moved directly into the Fledermaus module. And also you can view fly-throughs in iView4D, and that's our free viewer that's available online. This is just a screenshot of iView4D, the free viewer, and where you can get it. You can download the free viewer by going to our website www.ivs3d.com. And if you go to download iView4D, you just have to fill out some basic information and you pick your platform and you can download it. This is really useful if you make a cool scene with the fly-through and you want to show it at a demonstration, but you don't have your own computer, you can download iView4D to a different computer and then play your scene back there. Or if you want to give this to clients or colleagues that don't have Fledermaus, they can download iView4D. Next bit I want to go through is some movie making terminology, just some terms that I'm going to be using throughout the session today. The first is the flight path. A flight path is your motion through a scene, so it has the feel of like flying a plane through a scene. You make a flight path using a mouse or a supported 3D interaction device, or you can also use an XYZ path to generate a flight path. The term flight path is older terminology that we still use. It was more a reference from the version 6 of the software. Today, what the flight path really is a camera object with stored keyframes. So it's that flight-like motion is stored within this camera object. But we still say flight path all the time. The next bit of terminology is the camera object. So the camera object is specifically a physical model of a camera that exists within your scene. It's an SD file that looks like this. It is a little camera. It contains this camera model, which is a visualization for you of where you are as you move through this motion path. And stored within that camera are keyframes. So you see here in your Fledermaus scene, under the data objects, there's an actual object called camera 1. This is what it looks like visually. And then if you go to the camera's attribute tabs and look at its time tab, you'll see that it has keyframes. And those keyframes are the actual location of that camera at different points in time. So it's the X, Y, and Z, and also the camera's rotation, all stored for specific moments in time. This new ability with cameras and keyframes lets us edit the flight paths and also transfer them to a scene that's the same area, but if you change something about it, you can transfer it over, and because it has real geographic information stored in it, it will transfer to a similar scene. And then the last bit of terminology is the keyframe. A keyframe is an exact position or other attribute for a data object at an exact point in time. So here's an example of a camera's keyframes. You'll see we're looking at the object attributes for the camera object. I have camera highlighted there. That's the type of object we're looking at. And in its time tab, we're looking at keyframes for position and orientation for that camera. So as time was progressing, as we create the flight path, time will progress. At different points in time, it takes a snapshot of where that camera is. And that would be its X, Y, and Z position, and then the camera's rotation. You can also have keyframes for things other than time. You can have, or other than position orientation. You can have keyframes for scale, transparency, visibility, or frame. And also any data object in Fledermaus can have keyframes. So on the next slide, I have some examples of other types of keyframes. So at the top, I'm looking at a DTM object, and I'm looking at its time tab, and this DTM object has keyframes for transparency. So instead of changing position over time like the camera is, the object is changing its level of transparency over time. Underneath that, I have keyframes for an image. I've set it up so this image is changing its visibility over time. So at 22 seconds, it's not visible. At 3 minutes and 69 seconds, it becomes visible. The camera object and the keyframes all work together with the Fledermaus time interface. With version 7, we added this ability to work in 4D, to work with time. The time interface includes the time bar and some movie controls that lets you work with data that has time built into it, or work with things like the camera object. The use of the time interface lets us create these editable flight paths now. In version 6, you made a flight path. If you screwed it up, you had to start over. Now you can make small edits in it instead of starting from the beginning. The time interface also supports a lot of other things in Fledermaus. For example, playing back vessel strings via the vessel manager. There's some automatic playback of timestamped files, and currently that's just ASCII XYZ points. We also have some time-aware SD files. Specifically, these are coming out of the FM midwater module that does water column processing. Playback of surface series, and a surface series is a set of surfaces that are kind of mushed together to play back over time, so showing things like sand wave migration, stuff like that. So the time interface has a lot of uses, but we're really going to focus on the time interface and how it applies to making a movie today. So this is just a screenshot of the time interface elements, and we're going to review this in Fledermaus as well. But just to give you an idea, here's our Fledermaus interface. Up here we have the main visualization area, and you can see there's a camera object up there. The time interface I refer to is this bit in the center, and this is the user interface of the time. The first bit here in the red box is the time bar. So you see a bar with 2 seconds, 4 seconds, 6 seconds. And that time bar will show you time progressing. Next to that in the blue box you see the current time. So in the time bar there's a time slider, which is marked by the green circle. That time slider is moving along and time is progressing. And as it's moving, you'll get the exact time over here. That current time can include date. So if you're having an animation that's playing back over months or years or geologic time, you can add all that information into your animation or your movie. The playback rate is how fast it's playing. For a 30-second movie, you would want a rate probably of 1 second. If you're playing back some kind of change over geologic time, you're obviously going to want to speed that up so that you're not sitting there for a really long time watching things progress. The playback controls are kind of like movie controls. So there you'll have the record button, the play button, the stop button, fast forward, and rewind. So they work pretty much like a standard DVD player. And that's what we're going to use for making and reviewing our flight path. And then under the time down arrow, there's also some time and camera flight options here. So these are just different options for viewing your camera, changing begin and end times, if you want to set an animation to play on a loop, if you want to include the date in that current time, or if you want to clear an old flight path, you can do that there. This next slide is a demonstration of the relationship between the time and the keyframes and the object in your scene. So here in my scene I have a few different data objects including a camera SD. And we're looking at the attributes over here for that camera object. So focusing on the camera object and looking at the camera's time tab, this is the keyframe. So at 2.17 seconds in time, This is the keyframe for that point in time, and this is where the camera is at that point in time. If I were to move time back by sliding the time bar, the camera object would move back physically, and we'd be focusing on a different keyframe. So all of that is directly connected. At the same time that that camera has a specific position in time, other objects can also be doing something at that exact point in time. So here, instead of focusing on the camera object, I'm focusing on the Portsmouth chart object, which is an image SD. Looking at the image SD and looking at its time tab, I can see at 2.17 seconds, this image is 61% transparent. So not only is the camera moving through time, but this image is becoming more and less transparent over time. And we're going to talk about how to do this when we talk about advanced keyframe functionality. All right, so we're going to leave the PowerPoint for a moment. And I'm going to bring up a Fledermaus scene just to review the interface and also show you what one of these camera objects look like. Just a reminder that when I play the camera, it is definitely going to slow the rendering down. So try not to focus on that. It will look much better when you do this on your machine. So bring up a pre-made Fledermaus scene. All right, so in this scene, I have this is Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I have some topo LiDAR data, and that's the greenish-brown areas here. And then I have two pieces of bathymetry, some Consberg data here, the square shape survey, and then over here we have some Reason data. I have over here, these are my data objects list. This is my data objects list. So if I click the parent objects, you'll see all the things I have loaded in here. Here are the 3 DTM SDs. I also have an image loaded in this scene that I have turned off, but I can turn it on. And then finally, I have a camera object. So let's focus on that camera object and take a look at that. All right, so for every object in the scene, there's a set of data attributes. So if I were to focus on the 2001 bathy, each of these tabs refers to that object. So if I look at its DTM tab, it has things like transparency. The georeferencing shows the position of this SD, and its time tab shows if that SD does any change over time. If we focus on the camera object, here's the camera's main display object, so you can make your camera more or less transparent. But with the camera, what you're mostly focusing on is the time tab. So let me find that little camera. There it is. So there is the physical camera model. This camera model is an actual model in your scene to help you visualize your motion. This is the visualization of a flight path, and you can see this by going to the camera object, looking at its time tab, and turning on the show path. I didn't show you how to make one of these flight paths yet, but once I do, this is what the end result will look like. So here's the camera, and this tube is showing me the path that the camera takes through the scene. If I slide through time here, you'll see the camera moves back and forth. So I'm just left clicking and sliding on the time bar, and time is progressing, and the camera is moving to where it belongs in the scene at that specific point of time. I can also click on the camera's keyframes, and it will jump the camera to that point in time. When you make a flight path, you then can press play to review it. So I'll just press play now, and we'll see what it looks like. So again, you guys are going to have really slow update rates on this, but I'm just playing back a flight path that I made previous. All right, and I'll stop it there. So the camera is just recording some motion that I made in the scene and maintaining it as part of the scene. And that's just a quick overview of the Fledermaus scene and what a flight path and camera object look like. So I'm going to close that and go back to our PowerPoint for a moment. Oh, sorry. have to click through. Sorry, I started from the beginning. Okay, back to where we are. Okay, so the next step in movie making is actually creating a flight path. And there's two ways to create a flight path. You can do it dynamically or by importing XYZ keyframes. A dynamic flight path means you make a motion in your scene and it's recorded and stored in that camera object as you move. You can make a dynamic flight path using either a standard mouse or a 3D interaction device. As I have noted here, it's kind of hard to make a good flight path with a mouse, but it is possible. You do tend to get better results using some kind of 3D interaction device. The dynamic flight path is the most flexible. It lets you have the most control over the end product. The other option is to import XYZ keyframes in order to automatically generate a flight path along an XYZ path. That XYZ path is made from an ASCII point file, so just a basic text file with X, Y, and Z position. This option is very limited, but it can be easier for certain types of visualizations, like if you're following a linear route like a pipeline. For both of these options, after the flight path is created, you can edit them. If you're making dynamic flight paths, the three different ways you can do it, these are the supported devices. The first, again, standard mouse. So my typical little Bluetooth Microsoft mouse. You can use that to make a flight path, but it will be quite choppy and it's quite hard to get a very smooth flight path. You can also use one of our supported 3D interaction devices. The most accessible is the 3D Connection Space Navigator. It's commercially available from the 3D Connection website. It's less than $100, and it's supported by many different software programs, Google Earth, NASA Whirlwind, a bunch of different programs will let you use this little device. Another option is the Polhemus Patriot, and this is the famous bat that we use in Fledermaus, if you've ever heard people talk about the bat. This is a picture of the Polhemus, and if you probably can't see, but that little thing in the center of the picture is a 6-inch ruler. So this is quite a contraption to haul around, but it makes really great interaction. It makes very smooth paths. It lets you have really incredible control. It's very expensive, and it's generally not available anymore. But if you do have one laying around, this is still the best option for making a flight path. It just involves a lot of setup, getting things right. This is the 3D Connection Space Navigator is much easier to travel with. We also support some older options, the Logitech 3D Mouse and the Polhemus IsoTrack, but I do not have pictures or examples of either of those. If you're using the Space Navigator, that's the only option I'm going to talk about, really, because I don't have a bat set up here, and this tends to be what more people have now. A few tips for making it work for you. Make sure that you download the latest drivers from the 3D Connection website. If you purchase one of these, it comes with a CD of drivers in the box, and they will not work. So go get the newest drivers from the website, and you'll have much better time of it. Plug it in before you start Fledermaus. If you plug it in after, it either doesn't work or things get really goofy. It starts moving on its own. Another thing that you should note, you may have to manually start the drivers after you plug it in. This really seems to be platform dependent. I'm working on Windows right now, and I had to manually start the drivers. You could do that by going to your Start button, All Programs, 3D Connection, and Start Driver, and that will start it up. Usually when you start the driver, the thing starts to glow blue. In this picture, it's glowing blue. An actual blue light comes on. But it's been reported that that does not always happen. It happens for me most of the time, but I think on 64-bit platforms it wasn't happening. So usually the blue glow is a good sign, but you're not always gonna get it. When you're creating a flight path, you can do it in two different modes. The first option is turntable mode. These are different exploration modes in Fledermaus. Turntable mode is the basic mode you're in most of the time when you're in Fledermaus. When you're moving around, when you do rotations around the center of the space, that's turntable mode. You can also do flight paths in 3D flight mode, and that changes how you interact with the scene. Instead of moving around the center, you're very much flying through the scene. It allows more flight-like motion and better control, lets you make smaller motions like tilts and rolls and things like that that you cannot get with a turntable mode. Turntable mode tends to be very planar in motion, so you're always basically moving along the XY plane or up and down on the Z plane, whereas the 3D flight mode really lets you get in there and tilt and roll. If you're using a mouse, the only option is the turntable mode. So that is one of the limitations, and that's kind of why you get a really jumpy flight path. If you're using a 3D interaction device, depending on the device, you could use both. With a Space Navigator, you can use that in turntable mode or 3D flight mode. With the Behemoth or the Logitech, the other options, you need to use the 3D flight mode. With the Space Navigator, if you're just starting out, turntable mode tends to work pretty well. It gives you a little less control, and by giving you less control, it makes it a little bit easier for you. Other things that you have to set up when you're making a dynamic flight path, or that you might consider setting up if the basic turntable Space Navigator is not working well for you. Under Start and Preferences, you have 3D flying preferences. So File, Preferences, 3D flying. For the Space Navigator, you only have these two options, which are Novice and Advanced. In the Novice, it does not allow you to roll, and that gives you a little bit more control. If you're new to making flight paths, then you probably want to stick with Novice, and that is the default option. Once you get a little more practice, you can change it to Advanced, and that lets you get in there and make more motion. All of these other options down here, the device port, the predictor, and the movement thresholds, they only work for the BAT or these other types of devices. So you don't have to worry about those unless you're one of the few people who actually have a BAT. For the Space Navigator, there's a few other places where you can adjust the preferences. Again, in Fledermaus, under File and Preferences, if you go to the Turntable preference group, you can reverse the Space Navigator rotations. The Space Navigator rotations are set by default so that when you turn in a certain direction, it turns your scene in that direction. If you're using the Space Navigator on different programs, it may be the opposite of what you're used to. So if you don't like the results you get when you turn right, you can go in and reverse the Navigator rotations, and maybe it will feel better for you. The other place that you can change things with the Space Navigator is in the actual 3D connection control panel. So the Space Navigator is a commercial product, and it comes with its own set of drivers and its own set of controls. If you go to Start, All Programs, 3D Connection Control Panel, I think you can also click the right button on the Space Navigator. It will bring up control options for that, and that will really let you change the overall speed and also the speed of certain motions. You may find that your motion forward and back is very slow, whereas your rotation is really quick, and you can adjust that in the advanced settings over here. So the steps in creating a dynamic flight path, and we're going to go through these in a minute. The first thing you're going to want to do is create a scene. You're also going to want to plug in your device if you're using a device other than a mouse. Do that before you open the scene. Create the scene. What I do next is adjust my perspective. I get to a good starting point for my flight path, so I set myself up to be where I want my flight to begin. If you're going to go into 3D flight mode, you're going to want to change that next. So using a 3D device, or if you're using the Space Navigator, you can stay in Turntable. The next step is to press the record button. That's what the record button looks like there. When you press the record button, the camera object will be created automatically. So you'll see this when I start making the movie. Hopefully you'll see it if the rendering is fast enough. You'll see I'll press the record button, and automatically a camera object will be added to the scene, and it will start recording my motion. After you press the record button, you start moving around. As you move, the keyframes are being recorded. When you're finished, you press stop, and then you press play to review and see if you like the results. This is just a little hint. If you start doing your fly-through and your scene is melting, I don't have an image of this, but that's just the best way to describe it. What happens is the surface starts to disappear near the front or the back of your screen. That has to do with the near and far clipping planes of the visualization. If you see that occurring, you can adjust it again under File and Preferences. And this time you're going to look under the General Preference group. The first thing, if you're hitting the near clipping plane, so you're hitting the front of the screen is, the surface towards the front of the screen is starting to disappear. In that case, you want to increase the pushback scale. So that's right there. If you're hitting the far clipping plane, so your mountains and stuff in the background are starting to melt away, you can decrease the pushback scale. And again, right there. And if you're hitting both, you want to increase the far clipping plane, which is number 2 right there. Changing the near clipping plane doesn't do anything, so just let that alone. Some other tips as you're making this flight path. If you are stuck using a mouse and you're then therefore stuck in turntable mode, you have to be making motion in the X, Y, and Z or Z for a zoom to register. This is kind of hard to describe, but what I mean, if you are holding your mouse in one place and you zoom out to pan out from the scene, unless you're also moving in the X, Y, or Z, that motion is not going to register in the movie. Again, hard to describe, but if you've seen it occur, you probably know what I'm talking about. When you're making a flight path, the slower and smoother, the better the movie. You can always change the length. So if you fly very, very slowly, you can then compress it to make the movie shorter. The slower you go, just the smoother the motion, the better the result. When you have some jumpiness, it will be slightly smoothed out, but drastic jumps will remain in the movie. And sharp contrasts don't render very well. So if you have red and yellow very close together, or white and black, like in a nautical chart, that's going to tend to flash in your rendering. So if you can avoid that, it helps. If not, there are some ways to improve that when you actually do the physical movie rendering into an MPEG or WMV. Again, just a warning, when we start doing this, it's going to look really bad. So really focus on what I do and not the appearance of the flight path, and just try and get a feel for how you set these things up. Before I go into that, is there any questions in the audience that I should address? If I don't hear from my colleagues that are helping me out, I'm going to assume that all the questions are answered. Don't see any raised hands, so everybody's doing okay? All right, well then I'm going to continue. So let me get out of there and open up Fledermaus again. So this time I'm going to open a scene that does not have a camera object. So here we have a typical scene, again, looking at Portsmouth, New Hampshire. If you're not familiar with Fledermaus, just a quick review. This is your main visualization area. Here are your data objects. They can be turned off and on here by clicking on their little checkboxes. Here's my time controls, and here's my playback controls. So the first thing you do when you're creating a flight path, you plug in your device if you're going to use one. Other than that, the next thing you do is create a scene. So I've created a nice scene that I now want to fly through. I'm going to turn off my widgets. These are your widgets in the center of the screen, and you can turn those off here. I don't like them when I'm trying to do a flight path. The next thing I do is set up my perspective. So where do I want to start this scene? I usually like to be kind of zoomed out and looking down on the scene, like so. If you're going to be practicing this flight path a few times, or you think that you might have to do it more than once, you can set up kind of a bookmark to this. The way you do that is to go to Controls and View Manager. That will let you record a particular view and come back to it. So if I really like this starting position and I want to keep coming back to it because I'm going to practice this a few times, I can hit Record View here. And I can also change the name so I remember what this view was. So I can say this is my flight start 2 because I made one earlier. And then I can just minimize that, move it to the other screen, or close it and come back to it later if I screw up. To show you how that works, so if I then am back here, if I go to my controls, view manager, and hit flight start, it will take me back to that bookmarked screen. All right, set up your perspective. The next step is to press record. When I press this record button here, you're going to see a few things happen, maybe quite slowly. You'll see a camera object will be created in the scene down here. As I start to move, you'll see this time bar start to progress. So you'll see the time slider move along, and you'll see time start to progress here as well. So all of that will start to occur as I fly along. I am going to be making this flight path with a Space Navigator. That doesn't mean it's going to be great, but it will be a little bit smoother than using a mouse. So let me get started. I press record. Oh, by the way, if you're using a Space Navigator, you could be using a mouse as well. So right now, I'm moving my mouse to the record button, but my Space Navigator is also plugged in and ready to go, and I can switch between the two without changing anything. I'm also going to make this flight path in turntable mode. I again can go up here to exploration and change to 3D flight mode to get a little more control, but for this instance, I'm just going to leave it in turntable. All right, so I'm going to press record, and I'm going to start moving. And you should see the camera object in my list. Hopefully you see time progressing. And you should see the visualization moving. Doing my best to go slowly and smoothly, having varied results with that. All right, and when I'm finished, I move my mouse to the stop button and press stop. So now in this camera object, listed here as camera 1, I have recorded that motion I just made. To review it, I just go over here to the movie controls and press play. And again, your rendering is going to be quite slow, but eventually you should see me moving through the same flight path. So using the record and play, you record your motion and then you use play to review it. So I'm just going to stop that motion and zoom back out. That's the flight path itself. To see the physical flight path, I click on my camera object here. In the data attributes, these are the data attributes for the camera object itself. I go to the time tab. Here you can see all of the keyframes. Now before I started recording, there were no keyframes here. Once I started recording, it started taking snapshots in time. In the time tab, if I go to the far right, I can turn on show path. And what that's going to do is show me the path that the camera took through the scene. So there's my camera object, and here's the white path going through the scene. And I can slide the time slider along and see the camera moving through the scene, like so. All right, so that is how you make a dynamic flight path. I'm going to talk about editing it later, but before I go on, I'm just going to check if there's any hands raised on how to do the dynamic flight path. If you have a text question into Anya or anyone else, they will get to it as soon as they can. I'm just going to answer any verbal questions I see, and that if you want to ask me a question directly, just raise your hand. All right, not seeing any hands, so I'm going to minimize Fledermaus and go back to the PowerPoint. But again, that is a dynamic flight path, and that's how you make one. All right, back to our PowerPoint. Your next option is to create an XYZ flight path, and you do this by importing XYZ keyframes into the camera object. XYZ keyframes refers to generating keyframes from an XYZ path, and an XYZ path is just a 3-column point file with X, Y, and Z locations. You can make an XYZ path in Fledermaus using geopicking, and I'll show you how you can do that, or you can make it elsewhere, wherever you want to make just a typical XYZ type text file, and you can then import it into a camera object and use that path to generate keyframes. The steps to creating an XYZ flight path, again, you create your scene. You don't have to worry about setting up exploration mode or anything like that or plugging anything in because you're just going to be importing the points. When you're doing an XYZ flight path, the third thing you have to do is actually physically add the camera object. With the dynamic flight path, it automatically added that camera as soon as I hit record, but with this kind of flight path, you have to add the camera first. Once you've added the camera, you're going to go to the Camera Time tab, which is step 4. Under Options, you're going to choose to import XYZ keyframes. You're going to choose the XYZ file. You're going to set up the start and end time, the Z offset, and the camera angle, and you're going to press play to review. Once you set all this up and press import, it will bring it in, make a flight path, and then you can just press play to see what it looks like. When you're using the XYZ flight path, this is what happens. So this green line is representing my XYZ path over the surface. And I tend to make my paths by picking on a surface in Fledermaus. So the path itself really follows the contours of the surface. So there's my XYZ path. We're looking across the camera. So, map view would be looking down in this direction. Here's my camera object. When you import this XYZ path, you have to set the Z offset, and that is how far your camera is above the surface. So that's a demonstration of the Z offset. You have to set the camera angle from horizontal. So how far from looking straight out do you want this camera to be tilted? When you set the Z offset and camera angle for an XYZ flight path, they are stuck at that for the entire flight path. So it's not as dynamic as getting in there and making a dynamic flight path where you have a lot of control. When you do the XYZ flight path, it's always going to follow this one track, and it's always going to be the same height and same angle looking at the surface. And you can see here by the camera path that it will follow the Z of your XYZ path. So if your path goes up in Z, your camera will also move up because it's always maintaining the same Z offset. Some tips about using the XYZ to flight path. This option works really well if you're following a linear feature like a pipeline, vessel track, or a road. Low camera angles work well for giving a fly-through kind of feel so that you're actually looking out. If you have a high camera angle, you end up looking straight down on the scene, which doesn't tend to look all that good. If you have a very low offset, you'll feel like an ant crawling on the surface. You're going to be seeing the surface way closer than you really want to see it. But if you set an offset that's too high, the camera motions are exaggerated. So what was a little turn looks like a very wobbly turn from a high vantage point. And from my experience, few points seems to make a nice flight path. So if you can kind of go in a straight line between point A and point B, that's going to give you a nice smooth result. All right, so now back to my Fledermaus scene and how you can do an XYZ flight path. Just for the sake of not confusing things, I'm going to delete this first camera object. You can have multiple cameras, but it tends to get confusing, so I'm going, for safety's sake, remove that object and start again. All right, so XYZ keyframes, the first thing you do, you set up your scene. The next step, you go to Create and Add Camera. So again, this was a step we didn't have to do for the dynamic flight path. I add my camera in, and there is my camera 1 object, and looks exactly like the last one, except for if I look in the keyframes, there's nothing there. I haven't recorded any motion. The next step, you go to the camera's time tab, Options, and Import XYZ keyframes. First, I'm going to go through this with an XYZ file that I already created, and then I'll show you how you can make an XYZ file within Fledermaus. So I'm going to import XYZ keyframes. briefly, just to show you what this file looks like, it's just a typical XYZ file. Let me open up the file itself. So here's my flight path points. All it is column 1, column 2, and column 3, X, Y, and Z. Might be hard to see, but there's just 3 columns there. Very basic path with very few points, and I created it in Fledermaus. Okay, so you browse and you select the XYZ file that you're going to use. So I'm going to use my flight path points. You can choose a start and end time. It's setting my start and end time based on the last flight path I did. So that's why it goes from 0 to 42. It doesn't have to go that long, and you can adjust it to whatever you want. The next is the Z offset, and this is your camera's height above the surface. I did a little test beforehand, and I kind of liked how 30 works, so 30 meters above the surface. Generate rotations for the camera. This just makes bends smooth. So when you change direction in your flight path, it's gonna rotate the camera, and that just makes things look a bit smoother. And then the last thing you have to set is the camera angle, and it's down from horizontal. And I tend to find that a really low angle tends to work the best. So I'm going to go with 5. Hit import. And you can see a few things happen. The keyframes are populated here in my time tab, and there's the camera object. Now you don't have to worry about the fact that this camera is embedded in the surface. It looks really goofy, and you can fix it, but it's not going to affect your movie. I'll show you the movie first, and then I'll show you how you can fix this object if it bothers you. All right, so to see how my path turned out now, and again, you can turn on Show Path, and you can see that I made very few turns in this flight path. It's really quite straight. It goes just right through the 2 bathymetric surfaces and then over the LiDAR. If I hit play, this is what your result of your XYZ keyframes. And again, you guys are going to see a really slow version of this. But I like the height here. I'm not too close to the surface, not too far above it. And I like the angle. You're just looking out on the scene as you move through. But you can see you're always at the same height, you're always at the same angle. So you definitely don't have all of the abilities that you do with the dynamic flight path to really get in and move around features of interest. So I'll stop that and zoom out. If you want to adjust your camera object to make it not quite so large and funny looking, you can do that with these edit modes over here. And we're going to be talking about these modes again. These edit modes let you edit objects within Fledermaus, and they're quite useful for movie editing. In this case, I can use the scale mode, which is right here, to scale this camera and make it much smaller. So the way the edit mode works, if I click on scale, if I then left click on these little scale bars, it lets me make the camera smaller. That's not a necessary step. That's just more for your enjoyment and happiness. If you need to make an XYZ path, I'll briefly show you how to do that. The way I do it is using what's called geopicking in Fledermaus. So zooming out, let's say we want to make an XYZ path along this surface. I like to get looking top down to get a good perspective. You're going to use the select mode, which is over here under modes, and you're going to look at the geopicking tab. You don't have to look at it, but it helps so that you can see what's happening. Geopicking tab's down here. Most of the time you're looking at your object attributes tab. If you flip to geopicking, it's an empty table of XYZ points. As I use the select and start picking on the surface, it's going to populate this table with locations. So I'm going to get my select mode, and I'm just going to start clicking on the surface. And as I do, you'll see a pink dot goes on the surface and a point's added to this table. So I can just click along. And I told you fewer points the better, so I'll stop being so tightly spaced. If I just did a few points along the surface, I would get a flight path along there. And then I can say export, and it will save it as an XYZ file. So that's how you can get an XYZ file to use for this flight path. and you can clear it if you want to start over and do another one. All right, so that is XYZ flight paths and how you do them. Any questions about that before I move on? I don't see any hands raised, so I will continue to let the text questions be dealt with by Anya and my support team quietly sitting in the background, and I will move on. So let me minimize Fledermaus and back to my PowerPoint. The next thing you can do with a flight path is edit it. So you've created a flight path either using the dynamic flight path option or the XYZ. Once you've done that, you can edit it within Fledermaus. To do editing of a flight path, you're going to use the edit modes. I just showed you the scale mode, but for editing flight paths, you're going to use translate and rotate. You can also use the keyframe buttons. You can add and delete key. And typically, you'll use delete key. If there's a key that really jumps out of the path that you want to get rid of, you can select on it and delete it. All right, so again, back to Fledermaus. So let me turn on my camera and my flight path. And here's the flight path we created. I really like this one, but maybe I don't like where it does a bit of a jump over in here as it turns from the bathymetric surface to the LiDAR. So if I wanted to edit that, I can go back to the object attributes, look at the camera's time tab. I can scroll the camera through time, so I'm just left clicking and dragging on the time until I get to this bend, and I don't like that. I can find the keyframe that's associated with that. So when I'm about there, I'm at about 19 seconds. So it's about that keyframe there. And if I don't like that one, I can hit delete and that keyframe will go away. And you should see that the path just jumped. So if you have a kind of a sharp bend in your path, you can get rid of it that way. The other kind of editing you can do is to physically rotate or move the camera. So if I found that I was too close to the surface, maybe over here, I want to be a little bit higher up on this surface, I can use the translate mode to lift the camera physically higher, or the rotate to change the angle of the camera. So the way I'll first show you the translate mode, focusing on the camera objects, I go to the edit modes and translate. This puts a little translate axis in the middle of this camera, and I can just left click on any of these cones and drag, and it will start moving in the direction that the cone is pointing. So if I left click on the yellow cone and drag, it will physically pull my camera up. All right, so now my camera is going to do a little swoop over this part of the surface. If I wanted to change the rotation, I can go to the rotation edit mode, and this will change the position the camera is looking towards. So the red one's going to change it moving up. To review your changes, you have to press play. So I can press play, and you probably won't see it in your rendering, but eventually I should see a swoopy swoop as I go on about. All right, so you can use a combination of the edit modes and messing with the keyframes to improve your flight path and your visualization. All right, any questions about editing flight paths? All right, I don't see any hands. So again, back to my PowerPoint. And I am going to go over a few minutes, but not too much today. All right. After you make your flight path and you get your general motion down, you can also have other things changing over time, and this is what I call advanced use of keyframes. So my camera has keyframe positions, and that's showing where the camera is at different points in time. But I can also set up an image to change transparency, or I can have an object turn off and on over time. Basically, you're setting up one of the attributes for a different SD object to do something as time progresses. And this is just two screenshots of different time tabs for DTMs and one for images. All of the different objects have the same options. You can change the keyframes for position, transparency, visibility, or scale. And you can have any object change position as well. So for example, your camera's changing position, and that's your flight path. But at the same time, if you have a boat in your scene and you want it to move from point A to point B, you can have its position change as well. And then as your flight path is playing, that boat will also be moving along in the scene. If you want to alter other keyframes, the steps for doing that, you select the object of interest. So you're in your scene and you pick on, in your data object list, the object you want to alter. You go to that object's time tab. You choose the keyframe option that you want to edit, and that's the show keyframes for. You choose transparency, visibility, whatever. You click on animate this value, which is a checkbox next to the show keyframe for. You go to the object's main attribute tab. You drag the time slider to a point in time. You alter the attribute of interest, and then you continue to repeat. So you drag to a different point in time, alter the attribute. As you're doing this, because you clicked on animate this value, all of that is being recorded. So it's generating keyframes every time you change time and change an attribute. Continue through until you're finished with the change you want to make, and then press play to review. All right, so back to Fledermaus. So I have my flight path, and that can play through like so, and that exists, and I don't have to worry about that. Now I'm going to focus on having an image change transparency over time. So also in my scene, I have a image here. I have had it turned off, but I can turn it on, and it's just a Google Earth image of the Portsmouth area.
Hey, Erin, can I interrupt for a sec?
Sure.
There's a couple of questions which you might want to mention about that I noticed. If you're okay to take a second and answer some of those questions.
I could try my best. Yeah.
There was one question from Sarah, I guess, at MMT. Is it possible, for example, to join a dynamic flight path with an imported XYZ file and thus create a neat approach to a pipeline, and then just continue along the route? So I think she's trying to sort of blend, blend the approaches.
Okay, I don't know the answer, Mark. Do you?
Basically.
Can you help me out?
You can. Yeah, you can. You can import a. If you import an XYZ file that has a series of times, you can then go and move to the end of that time, and then use the record button to continue on and make a flight path. I'd have to think about doing it at the beginning of your existing route. That would be the only spot where I'd have to try.
Okay.
It is possible, but there are some limits. There was another question about undoing edits. I think the answer to that is if you use the translate, rotate, and scale controls, there is just above the object list by the exaggeration, there is the undo button, and that will undo any of the translations or rotations you've done. Although if you actually manually edit the numbers or something like that, then the undo, I don't believe you can undo those.
Okay, so here's the button Mark's talking about. There's a little undo there, and that will undo rotation. So I just undid my rotation. If I undo again, it will it moved the camera back down. I don't know why it didn't adjust the path, but the camera's back down there. So if you're using these edit modes here, this undo should work back to the last time you saved, or so I've been told. But if you change down here, that may not work. Yes?
Yeah, I think that's the case, yes. And there was a question about, which I think you're sort of going to show maybe a bit coming up. There was a question about, can you show like a rising water level example? Which I assume that means like putting a plane in the scene and having it translate up as a function of time to show the impact of a rising water level.
Yeah. After I could do the image, and then I can quickly do how you can use a plane to show rising water level.
I think that's the other ones I think have all been answered.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, so I'll first do a demonstration of changing visibility, and then I can do a quick demo of changing something's position over time. So again, I have my flight path, and here is this Google Earth image of Portsmouth that I just georeferenced in my scene. So if I want to have, I'm going to have this image change transparency over time. I'm going to have it fade out as I move through the scene. So if I move my time slider back to 0, then my camera is at the beginning of the flight path. I want to focus on the image, so I'm going to select that object in the data object list. And I'm going to focus, again, remember when you select a different object, you're looking at that object attributes. I want to look at the images time tab. I want to change the keyframes for the image. I want to change its transparency. And I want to animate this value. All right, so you set that all up. And then you can go back to the image tab. The reason being is that's where I can change transparency. So I can go back to that tab, and I can say, all right, at 0 seconds, I'm good with the level of transparency. I want it to be completely opaque, so I just leave it as is. But then as I start to get close to where this image is, so you see, if you can see my camera is starting to come over the image, I've dragged the time slider along to about 12 seconds. I can say at this point, I want the transparency to start to fade out. So maybe about there. And then as I move further and I start to get into the LiDAR, maybe I want the transparency to come back on. All right, so I just did 2 changes, one at about 12 seconds and one at about 19 seconds. And if I look at the time tab, you'll see because I clicked on that animate value, as I changed time and transparency, it recorded that in the keyframes. So at 12 seconds, it's about 69% transparent, and at 19 seconds, it's only about 9%. To see how this works then, you can drag through the time slider. So if I drag through the time slider, there it's transparent, and there it's opaque. And it's starting out at 69% because of this keyframe. I can add another keyframe at 0 seconds where it's fully opaque if I wanted to. The other way you can see the change other than dragging the time slider is to press play. And hopefully we'll zoom out enough that you can see the image option. There's the image coming in, and it's really lightly transparent. And eventually, as we get further along, it just starts breaking up. So now it's becoming more opaque. So it's hard for you guys to see. Now, on my screen, the image is completely opaque, and there's lots of transparency. All right, so let's change the transparency option. And then the question about how you can show a position change over time. If you want to fake a sea level rise, you can use a plane to do that. So I can create and add plane. And this just makes a flat plane in my surface. The plane got dropped under the imagery there, so let me drag it out. This is just a separate object that you can create in Fledermaus. And I can change that plane so that it's blue. And I can make it slightly transparent. All right, so that's going to be my water level. And I'll set the height at 0. So right now my plane is at 0, and it's faking a good water level in my scene. If I want to have that plane move up and down over time, I can again go to its time tab. I'm going to want to change the position and orientation, so I leave that alone. Click on animate the value. At 0 seconds, I want it to be where it is. So I'm going to go ahead and add a key. So at 0 seconds, it's at about 0. And sometimes it's just a little bit different in the keyframe value here. You don't have to worry about that too much. Then to change the plane's height, I can again go back to the plane tab, and you can change the plane's height using this visual properties height here, or you can use the translate button, either or. So I'll say at 5 seconds I want the height to go to +5, and it will jump up. And then at 10 seconds I want the height to go to +10. All right, and you'll see that the plane's moving up along the trees, right? So we're flooding the land. If I look at the time tab, you'll see as I made those changes, the keyframes have been recorded. And we probably won't see it very well moving through because of the nature of the flight path. But if I just drag the time slider, you'll see that plane moving up and down. Hopefully you can see that. Let me get a bit closer. So do you guys see the plane going up and down the trees? All right. So that's two examples of how you can set up keyframes for things other than the camera. And you don't need a camera object. You can set up animations like this completely independent of that camera object. Or you can have this kind of change occurring with the fly-through as well. So it's up to you how you use this functionality. All right, so that's how you can do that. I hope that was a good demonstration for everybody. I'm going to minimize Fledermaus. Back to the PowerPoint. Just a few more things to go through. Bear with me. If you have to leave, feel free to leave. If not, thanks for sticking around. All right, so you've completed the flight path. You've made some animation changes. You're really happy with your scene. What can you do with it? Your first option is to save the scene. When you save the scene, that flight path is stored in there. And when you open it again in Fledermaus, or if you open that scene in iView 4D, you can press play and you can see the flight path. So that's one option, and that's a pretty nice option. The other option is to render out a movie, which will create an actual MPEG or WMV file. And then that's something you can put up on your website, put on YouTube, or distribute to clients or whatever. If you're doing the MPEG or WMV option, you're going to, after you create your flight path and you save it, you're going to go over to Tools and Render Movie. And when you do that, you'll get the Render Movie dialog. So the first thing you'll do is select the camera. You can have multiple cameras in your scene, but for not being confusing, I try to just keep one in my scene. You give the flight a name, so it's just going to be, I name mine Portsmouth flythrough.wmv. You pick the output format, length, rate, frames. I'm going to talk about these in the next slide. All right, so focusing on that render movie dialog. For the format as far as whether you have the option for a WMV or an MPEG, that's controlled by your operating system. If you're on Mac, you can only create an MPEG. If you're on Windows, you can only create a WMV. And that's a change we made in between 6 and 7 so that we can do better rendering of the movie. If you choose to save an image sequence, so if you choose the JPEG or the TIFF sequence, you can then take that image sequence and render it in a different program. So for example, QuickTime or Adobe Premiere Studio. There's a lot of movie rendering programs that will take that set of images and compress them into a movie that you can distribute. So that's a different option. The length controls the overall length of the movie. When you first open this dialog, that length will be whatever length your flight path was. You can change it here. You can make it shorter or longer. So if you've made a nice, slow, controlled flight path, you can then shrink it so that it's easier. So it's easier to play back, so that people aren't watching a movie for too long. The rate is the rate of playback, and usually it's 1:1. If you adjust the overall length, then this rate will adjust to play the number of frames you have over the time that you have set. The number of frames is the total frames in your flight, so that is just how many frames existed as you went through and it recorded keyframes. The width and height are the width and height of the final rendered movie. And this is a bit difficult. The movie, once it renders, by default will be 720 by 480. And that's the size of the window of the movie. So if you were in Fledermaus making your flight path and you weren't observing this ratio, which is a 1.5 ratio, so 1 to 1.5, I believe. If your width wasn't slightly higher than your height, the final movie might have chopped off sides or chopped off top and bottom, depending on what part of that ratio you didn't respect. So right now that's kind of hard to compensate for. You kind of just have to set up your Fledermaus screen to be about the width and height you set here. In a future release, we're going to have some way to help you do that, adjust your actual Fledermaus screen so that you're looking at the ratio that your final movie will be using. This width and height is important depending on what you plan to use the movie for in the end. If you're just going to be playing it back on a computer, I think it could be pretty much anything. But if you have to use this for HD TV or a DVD, you're supposed to use very certain ratios so that it will play back correctly. The frame rate is how many frames played per second. The default's 24, and that seems to work pretty well. And again, this is important depending on what you're going to use the final product for. For HD, DVD, there's certain recommended frame rates and such to use. The bit rate is the amount of data per second. Higher bit rate tends to give a higher quality, and the default's 1800, but recommendations I've heard are for 2400, so I just upped this to 2400. And then the last is the anti-aliasing. What the anti-aliasing does is it physically renders the movie larger than necessary. So it makes the movie bigger while it's rendering it, and then it compresses it back down into 720 by 480. You don't really see this happening, and the reason you do this is it makes the movie smoother. If you have high contrast changes, say black and white or red next to yellow, when you play that movie back, you might see a kind of a flashing between those pixels. The anti-aliasing smooths that out a little bit, and we recommend 3 for that. If you get higher than 3, you're not really getting good results for the extra processing power and extra pixel resolution that you need to process that. Things to know if you're creating an MPEG or WMV. Scenes or flight paths with fast changes and high contrast are hard to remember, and that's where you can use the higher bit rates and the anti-aliasing. This is the width-height ratio that I talked about. You want to try to adjust your Fledermaus screen to about the size of the movie so that what you see when you're recording the flight path is what you see in the final product. Just a bit about bit rate and how 24 tends to work a little bit better. Anti-aliasing will improve quality, but if you get higher than 3, it's not really useful. And you should consider what you're rendering your movie for. You can look online and find what recommended bit rates, frame rates, etc. are for HD, DVD, etc. Another thing to know when you're making an MPEG or WMV, unless you're rendering in an off-screen buffer, and that's a preference you set, and it has to be supported by your video card and everything else, unless you choose that in your preferences, general, render movies and off-screen buffer, you are going to be rendering this movie actively on your desktop. So what that means is you want to make sure your laptop's plugged in. It does take a while. You don't want it to die in the middle. If you are doing it without the off-screen buffer, you also want to turn off your screensaver. You want to make sure your computer isn't going to go to sleep. I turn it to be several hours or never, just to be safe. Turn off your screensaver and turn off any notifications that might pop up. The reason being, if your screensaver comes up or your Skype pops up and that overlaps the movie rendering window, you're going to see that in the movie. Usually with something small like Skype popping up, it's so quick that you may not notice it in the final product, but if your screensaver comes on for 15 minutes, you're going to have a movie of your screensaver. Alright, so just to show you, to review how you do the rendering, and also your options for playing back the movie. So first, if you decide to just play the movie back in iView or Fledermaus, you would save your scene. So I can say File, Save Scene, and save it as Portsmouth. And I'll just take a minute to save. Once I've done that, that camera is saved in there, my flight path saved. I can close that scene. And I can open Fledermaus back up, or I can open iView 4D, which is the free viewer. I can open that scene. Now, before I save the scene, it would have been a good idea if I turned off the path, because you don't want to see that in your scene. But once somebody opens the scene, you can press play, and then they can just see the flight path you created. And this is just the free viewer that's available online, so you don't need the full software to see the flight path playing back. But I'll kill that so it doesn't destroy everyone's bandwidth. The other option, if I open Fledermaus back up and open that scene again, again, you can play it back in Fledermaus by pressing play, or you can render the movie. So to do that, you go to Tools, Render Movie, and that will bring up the Render Movie dialog. You just give it a name, so I can call it Portsmouth Flight. You set everything up. Again, I usually raise the bit rate, keep the anti-aliasing, and I leave most of the rest the defaults. You hit OK, and what it's going to do as soon as you hit OK is start rendering this movie in your desktop, like on your desktop in the visualization area. And it takes a while. So go get lunch or go get coffee or something, because it's going to use your screen to start rendering bits of the movie. And what you'll see is portions of the movie flashing across your screen. You just let it go for a while. So I am not going to do that. But when you're done, you'll get a WMV file that you can give to people, put on your website, etc. All right, so let me see if there's any final stuff I wanted to talk about. Nope, that was the end. So if there's any final questions, I am available. You can raise your hand or you can text your question in and one of my helpers will let me know. I do see a question, when will the presentation be available? If you're under maintenance, we record these webinars and we make them available to our clients under maintenance. It usually takes us a few days to get them up. This one I hope should be up by next week sometime, as long as we don't run into any issues. Any other questions? All right, I'm going to say that that's no more questions.
I don't think so. I think you got them.
All right, thanks, Mark. Thank you guys all for attending. We'll have another webinar in January. I think it will be on habitat mapping uses of Fledermaus or something like that. And we try to have one a month, so keep an eye on your email or on our website for the next session. And thank you again. Bye.